inking and painting was primarily performed by women and was seen as women's work. A full explanation of why this was the case, especially during a time when women working at all was unusual and even looked down upon, is far beyond the scope of this video. In fact, many at the time didn't even understand it. Walt Disney was actually asked about this in a magazine interview in 1935, and this is what he had to say.
Very frequently, they are better artists than men, but for some reason, they lack the knack of getting smooth action into their drawings.
This was actually a pretty progressive view for the time, especially since the general view was that men and women had completely different skill sets and roles they could be good at, and that women's were entirely related to homekeeping and child rearing. However, there were some jobs, such as telephone operators, secretaries, and stenographers, that became broadly seen as jobs for women, and inking and painting was one of these. Again, this is a huge topic, but suffice to say that despite being an essential part of the animation process that required the talents of hundreds of skilled artists, inking and painting was often regarded as a secondary or even trivial part of the industry simply because it was being performed by women. Nothing could have been further from the truth. The first step of inking and painting is the inking part. Inking is the initial tracing of the pencil and paper drawing onto an animation cell. However, it's more than just tracing the drawing. There's an element of artistic interpretation as well. The inkers had to understand the finer points of the animation in order to reproduce the drawings with the personality and feeling intact. According to animator Ward Kimball,
those inkers had to be really good. They weren't just tracing the animator's drawings, they had to get the feeling of the animator's pencil lines too.
Painter Ruthie Thompson put it this way.
I don't know whether the inkers get enough acclaim or not, but they are artists, all of them. And they have to be. The animators were always complaining for fear that they wouldn't get all their action in, and they'd miss it by a squirt of hair or something like that. So the inkers, the ones who could do it beautifully, were the ones that should get a little more praise.
Painting was the process of then coloring in the ink drawing. This was far more complicated than it might seem. First of all, lighting, texture, shading, dimension, and movement were all expressed through color. Not only that, but all of it had to be perfectly consistent. If even one frame wasn't inked or painted perfectly, it could ruin the entire sequence. This meant that the hundreds of ink and paint artists all had to produce the same quality of work across the tens of thousands of cells that would be inked and painted for Snow White. However, so far I've only really scratched the surface of what the ink and paint department was responsible for. They had to develop the paints themselves in hundreds of different colors, since full-color animation had been pioneered by Disney and was a completely new industry. Everything had to be created in-house. Furthermore, the ink and paint department was also in charge of creating special effects for the animation, such as motion lines, shadows, underwater effects, reflections, smoke, and twinkling stars.